Hey guys, this is Eric. Today I'm going to be bringing you part one of my Traveling with An Ostomy series. Now, this part will deal with preparing for your trip, so stay tuned. So I do want to make it a point to say that just because you have an ostomy doesn't mean you're going to be limited with the trips that you take and things like that. I know a lot of ostomates who actually go on all kinds of travel adventures, and it doesn't slow them down, it doesn't stop them, and I certainly wouldn't want it to stop you. So I'm hoping that this guide will at least give you some ideas and maybe some reassurance that air travel, or any kind of travel for that matter, is totally possible with your ostomy. Okay, so you've got an ostomy, you're ready to go on a trip, now what? So these are common questions that you're going to probably be asking yourself. I know I certainly did when I started traveling again after my surgery. And keep in mind, this is coming from someone who's never traveled really in their adult life. So I was dealing with both having to travel for the first time and having to travel with an ostomy. So a lot of these questions kind of came up, and a lot of these tips that I'm going to give are through my own experience with traveling, as well as some of the tips that I've learned through other ostomates. Okay, so the golden rule when you're packing ostomy supplies for a trip is to bring more than you think you're going to use. And I would say triple the amount of supplies that you think you're going to be using on a regular basis. So for me, for example, I tend to change my appliance every 3 days when I'm at home. But when I go out on a trip, I'll usually bring enough supplies to last every single day. So, if something comes up, if there's a leak, if there's some unforeseen issue that happens, I know that I'll be covered at least to have to change that appliance every single day. Now, keep in mind that there will be some supplies that may be harder to get when you're out. So always make sure that you've got something in there. Even if you don't tend to use it a lot at home, make sure that you've got at least a small sample size even of a certain product that you feel might be useful. So for me, for example, I don't traditionally use barrier rings day to day when I'm at home, but I know that if there's a situation where, for example, I've got like a lot of irritation for some unknown reason when I'm on a trip, I know that I can use the barrier rings to help create a better seal around the appliance and hopefully heal that skin up. So that might be something I would pack. Now, one of the things that you should probably be aware of is that when you're going through air travel and going through security checkpoints, they're going to check to see what kind of liquids you have and the quantity of liquids that you have. Now, the TSA has a rule called the 311 rule. I know for a lot of people who've traveled, you'll probably be familiar with this rule. But it basically states that you should try to keep any kind of liquid bottles or packages or anything like that that you're bringing in your carry-on to 100 milliliters or 3.4 ounces or less, and you're only allowed to bring 1,000 milliliters worth, so 1 liter's worth, and in a single bag, and you're only allowed to bring one per passenger. So I know it can be a little frustrating to hear that, because if you want to bring sunscreen, if you want to bring toothpaste, you want to bring shampoo, and then you've got liquid ostomy deodorants, for example, or liquid aerosols, or things like that you want to bring along, that's going to really, really restrict the number of supplies you can bring. Now, under the TSA's liquid rules, things like stoma paste, barrier rings, which surprised me, liquid pouch deodorants, any kind of liquid adhesive remover, anything like that, those would all be considered liquids. Even the barrier rings, and I had called the Canadian TSA agency to ask them about that, and they said if it's like a gel-like, kind of like a moldable thing, then that actually falls under a liquid for them. So that might be something to keep in mind, especially if you are someone who goes through a lot of barrier rings. That's possibly going to take up a lot of space in your luggage. Now, if you're traveling with checked luggage, then there really are no limitations. You can put the majority of your supplies there. But I would highly suggest you always keep at least some supplies with you, either on your carry-on or actually with you in a purse or something like that, and then have some other supplies in your check luggage. You never want to be in a situation where all your stuff is in your check luggage and you don't have access to it, because stuff can happen. You might lose your luggage, it might be delayed. There may be a situation where you'd have to change your appliance while on the airplane, and if you've got everything in your check luggage, you're going to be screwed at that point. So I would highly, highly recommend keeping your supplies separate and always keep at least some supplies with you. I know that for certain airlines, they say, well, medical supplies are exempt. But I personally found that when I was calling around asking, it seemed to really depend on the person you were talking to. So some of them would say, oh yeah, no, if it's a medically necessary supply, then you can kind of bring more than what you're normally allowed to. But then you talk to someone else and say, well, it's really up to the person who's at the security checkpoint to determine whether or not you can do that. So I really didn't feel comfortable doing that. I didn't want to have to go there and then them say, well, no, you got to dump half of these supplies. So I personally just packed as much as I could in the little 1 liter bag that I was bringing. And I was pretty efficient with space. So for example, for certain items, like adhesive remover, I didn't bring the whole bottle of adhesive remover spray. I just brought wipes, and the wipes work good enough. They're not as fast for me to use, but they are effective at removing the wafer and removing any residue, and those packages are a lot easier to travel with. So things like that you have to be cautious about. You should always consult with the TSA and whoever you're flying with just to make sure that those rules haven't changed. But I know for myself that was a bit of a challenge. Now, for a lot of people, you can probably get away with not packing so many of the other liquids in your carry-on. So as an example, you don't have to bring shampoo. Most hotels will have it, and most destinations that you go to will sell shampoo at a local shop. So, stuff like that you don't necessarily have to bring with you, so that will make more room for supplies. Now, keep in mind that if you're bringing liquid ostomy supplies and other liquids, you do have to keep them together. So I would actually prefer that you keep everything, every liquid or gel or anything like that, in that single bag, and then you'll have that handy. If you separate it, that might put you in a situation where you're having to explain why you've got 2 bags of liquid, and you don't really want to go through all that. Now, one of the things that I tend to pack with me, and it's not something that I would normally use on a day-to-day basis at home, but I find it's extremely important, at least as an assurance when I'm on any kind of trip, are gelling agents. Now, gelling agents are meant to solidify any liquid output in your bag. And why would you want to do that? Well, a lot of people get traveler's diarrhea when they go to a foreign country. And if you've had traveler's diarrhea, you probably know that it will oftentimes ruin your trip. And for those of us who have an ostomy, any kind of unexpected diarrhea or unexpected liquid output or high volume output is bound to create issues with your appliance. You're probably going to be more prone to leaks and that sort of thing. So what the gelling agents do is they'll solidify that output and make it easier to manage. Now, that could be something that you'll want to do anyway if your output tends to be thin. And I know that for me, it's really convenient to just pop one in. If my output isn't liquid, no big deal. It just empties along with my regular output. But if I do have some changes in my bowel movements, and for some reason there's liquid output there, it will solidify it, and it's way, way, way easier to manage like that. Now, another thing that I like to pack are accessories. So things like ostomy support belts or ostomy wraps or stoma guards. And it really depends on what I plan to be doing. So for example, if you're going to a destination that you feel you're going to be doing a lot of like extreme things, perhaps skydiving or things like that, then I would suggest bringing perhaps a stoma guard. If you're going to be going to a place that has, beautiful beaches and you're going to be out in the water a lot, then I might consider bringing a support band or some kind of swimming accessory to go along with my appliance. Now, those accessories, again, they're usually totally optional. They're not necessities like supplies would be. But I know for a lot of people, they'll make you feel more comfortable. And, they're generally nice to have anyway because you might be wearing clothing, for example, to go out that will make you feel more comfortable with. Now, for many of us who have an ostomy, chances are we're also taking medication or taking supplements of some type. So that's something that you're going to want to consider when you're traveling. And what I would suggest doing if you're traveling with any kind of medication or supplements is try to leave it in the original container with the label there. And if possible, have some kind of doctor's note explaining why you need these medications. I know sometimes people get stopped during the security checkpoint, and they maybe question, like, what are these unknown pills that you're carrying around with you? So just to make things a lot smoother, I would always keep the label on there. I tend to keep my medications and supplements together with my liquid supplies, but just in another bag so that they're not all mixed in. And that way, as they're looking at the liquids, they can also see that I have medications and pills and things like that with me as well. Now, for those of you who aren't taking medication or pills, supplements and things like that, I would still suggest that you bring Imodium. And Imodium is going to help with that traveler's diarrhea if, in the unfortunate event, you do develop it. And that will help to slow things down significantly for you until, things get better for you. Now, another thing you'll want to consider is perhaps bringing along an electric razor. I know for me, I have to shave around my stoma, so I find that electric razors are probably the most convenient way to do that, especially if you're out and about. You should be able to bring razor blades as well, as long as they're, small and under a certain size. And another thing that I do want to mention is if you tend to cut your wafer and you bring scissors, the TSA will allow scissors under a certain size, and assuming that they have rounded tips. So I tend to use like medical safety scissors. They have a very short blade. They've got a rounded tip, and there's no trouble doing that at all. I know some people like to cut their wafers beforehand so that they kind of avoid any trouble. Because my stoma tends to change just slightly, I find that it's better for me to just measure and cut as I'm actually doing an appliance change. So that's just makes me feel more comfortable doing that. Another option for some people is to bring just moldable wafers. Now, moldable wafers allow you to really get an excellent fit around your stoma without the need to go with something that's pre-sized and without having to cut a hole there. So that would actually be super, super convenient if moldable wafers work for you. So that will also cut down on the amount of extra supplies and things like that you're bringing along, especially things like scissors or measuring guides and that sort of thing. Now, as far as packing snacks and drinks, you are allowed to travel with food and drink, but keep in mind that any kind of liquid, like beverages, stuff like peanut butter, jams, margarine, anything like that is still considered a liquid, and that will still fall under the 311 rule that the TSA has. So I would personally not bring anything like that from home. If you're going to be consuming any kind of liquids, buy it at the airport after you've passed the security checkpoint, and you're usually allowed to bring those on board. But keep on top of your hydration in the meantime. Don't fall behind on drinking enough fluids just because you're waiting for a time to drink while you're on the plane. Now, as far as snacks are concerned, I find that like energy bars, any kind of like granola bars, things like that are perfectly fine to bring on board. I always keep some with the carry-on bag that I'm traveling with. And that way, if I get hungry while I'm waiting, or even if I'm on board and I have access to my bag, I can just have a quick snack there. Now, another question that I was asking myself before I would go on flights was, like, what seat am I going to pick? Where am I going to actually be? Because I know there's a lot of concern, especially if you're on a very long flight, with having to constantly get up to use the bathroom to empty your pouch, for example. And like, am I going to disturb people? Are people going to be bothered by that? So my suggestion personally would be, if you're on a short flight and you know that your stoma isn't going to be active, you don't have to really go to the bathroom, during a 1 or 2 hour flight, go with the window seat. It's such a beautiful view most of the time if you're flying during the day, and you won't really be bothered by other people having to get up and you having to stand up to let them through. However, if you're going on a long flight, I would recommend going with an aisle seat, preferably one closer to the bathroom. You don't have to be right at the bathroom, but closer to the bathroom. And that way you have access to the aisle without really having to disturb any of the other passengers. So that's something that I would certainly recommend. All right, so now that you've finished preparing and packing, it's off to the airport and time to get on your flight. So I'll be covering that in part 2, so stay tuned for that.